The first part of this scripture in John 14 is really my go-to scripture that I often use at funerals. Very much like 1 Corinthians 13 is the go-to scripture passage I wait for many pastors. But I have to admit that after researching the scripture passage for this particular sermon, I might need to reconsider how appropriate it is to proclaim this scripture in the midst of the celebration of life and entering into new life that is observed at a funeral. I say this mainly because while the scripture hints to life after death, more specifically life after Jesus is gone, the scripture very much talks about living faithfully in the midst of this life. Too often we think of the thereafter and not enough of the right now. At the heart of this passage, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about how they need to live their life here on this earth. Jesus starts off by saying that don't let your hearts be troubled. As usual, there's power behind these words that Jesus speaks. Usually when someone, including Jesus, says something to the effect of don't be afraid, don't worry, don't be scared, someone's probably facing a situation that is most likely scary. And they have reason to be afraid. And the disciples in our scripture have reasons to harbor a lot of fear. Our scripture is located in what many scholars identify as Jesus' farewell discourse in the Gospel of John. During these chapters, Jesus is preparing his disciples and followers for the time when he will no longer be with them. As if news of Jesus' upcoming departure wasn't heartbreaking enough. In the midst of all of this, Jesus tells his disciples some unsettling news about some of their very own. Judas will betray Jesus, and Peter, unquestionably Jesus' closest disciple and friend, will deny Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And after hearing news like that, it's not surprising that Jesus' disciples are a little afraid and have their doubts about Jesus. You know, we give the disciples a hard time because it seems at times they don't really get it, and that's true. They've been with Jesus and worked with him and were first-hand witnesses to his ministry and miracles, and still yes. They didn't understand who Jesus was. Perhaps when we read a passage about the disciples, we think that we wouldn't act like that. We wouldn't be so dumbfounded and confused about Jesus as the disciples seem to be so often. We would know exactly what Jesus was talking about. And we would fully understand his ministry. But people, let's be honest, we'd probably just be as flabbergasted as the disciples were. We who are thousands of years removed from Jesus' physical body on earth, we have the advantage of the written document of the Bible and the expertise from those who for a living study the Bible. True, the first disciples were in the very midst of the physical Jesus and breathed the same air and shared in the same space as him. But what we're forgetting is that what Jesus did and accomplished, and Jesus' very own presence, was groundbreaking and shocking. There is no one like him before. So it's not surprising that the disciples' confidence in Jesus was beginning to waver. And Jesus senses this. He senses their nervousness. Throughout our scripture, Jesus seeks to reassure his disciples that they know who he is, because they know who God is. The disciples can be sure that Jesus and God are one, and that God has sent Jesus to them. When you see Jesus, you see God. When you see God, you see Jesus. And Jesus is asking them to remember and to trust that what they see him doing and saying comes from God. Jesus encourages his disciples that they know the way he is going. But Thomas, poor doubting Thomas, as he's called, he retorts they do not know where Jesus is going, and how can they know of the way that Jesus speaks? And Philip, in the midst of all this, needs some more confirmation. It says that if Jesus shows them God, then he and the rest of the disciples will be satisfied. Satisfied of what? That what Jesus tells them is actually true. And he is the one they've been searching and longing for so very long. I don't picture Jesus' words in our scripture carrying a discouraged tone, where Jesus is frustrated that the disciples have their doubts and just don't get it. Instead, Jesus is trying to ease their anxiety and stress. Jesus knows the disciples will need to hold on to what he taught them. The disciples will need to be fully confident of who Jesus is, especially when events start taking a turn for the worst. With Jesus' arrest, his trial, his beating, his awe-shocking crucifixion and resurrection, and his farewell ascension. The disciples and all those who come after Jesus will have to rely on Jesus' words in our scripture to carry them through those trying times. Believe in God. Believe in me. Trust who I am. Trust your God who has sent me to do what I must do. It's very interesting that the scripture passage that occurs before Jesus' resurrection is placed in the possible lectionary passages that can be preached this fifth Sunday after Easter. Why would this pre-Easter passage be appropriate for this post-Easter day? And here's what I think about that. The overall message of this passage is for Jesus' disciples to follow and to cling onto his way of living and being, to hold on to God's way. Jesus says to him being Thomas, I am the way and the truth and the life. Some of you may not know this fact, but that statement includes the word way, the way. And the way was how the early church identified themselves. And for me, that's very telling. The early church could have given themselves any other name, identifying what they were all about, but they chose the way. Perhaps the disciples got that name from Jesus mentioning that he was the way in our scripture. By the early church choosing to call themselves the way, it signifies that the disciples sought to follow the way that Jesus had shown them and taught them. The word way signifies a movement and a journey, a fluidity that the disciples and all others who would come after would engage in if they were to be followers of Christ. And we are living testaments and witnesses of this way of living ourselves. No matter who we are and how long we have lived, we have all experienced some really tough situations, some parting relationships, some colossal letdowns that have shaken our foundation and the very core of who we are. For many of you, this church and I have been beside you during some of your toughest times. And I remember hearing in the midst of those situations that from your very own mouths, yes, that you were experiencing, that what you were experiencing was so very hard and unbearable at times. But you were thankful that you had a firm faith to carry you through your time of tribulation. And that's exactly what Jesus was getting at in the scripture. He was helping to lay a solid foundation of faith for his disciples.